Our second speaker is Mohamad Ballan, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Stony Brook University. He's a historian of the late medieval and early modern Mediterranean world. In both his writing and his teaching, Ballan highlights the interconnected histories of Europe, Africa, and Asia through a close examination of social, intellectual, and political networks. In his first manuscript, Lord of the Pen and Sword, Sovereignty and History in the Islamic West, Ballan explores the phenomenon of the scholar-statesman, figures who ascended to the highest offices of state through the life and works of Lisān al-Dīn ibn al-Khaṭīb, the most prominent Spanish Muslim historian, chancellor, and philosopher of the 14th century. Mohamad holds a PhD in history from the University of Chicago and has previously held appointments as a junior fellow at the Dartmouth Society of Fellows and as a Mellon faculty fellow at the Medieval Institute at the University of Notre Dame. He also maintains a popular scholarly blog. And the title of his talk today is Andalusi Peregrinations and Scholarly Circulations, Migration, Mobility, and the Community of Letters in the Late Medieval Mediterranean World.
Set up here. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. Trying to find my, oh, there it is. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your attention and your time today. It's a real pleasure to be back here. Did I not share my screen? Okay, I did something wrong. Here we go. Just like that? Perfect. Excellent. Sorry, Zoom people. So here we go. I'll start again. So it's a real pleasure to be back here today. I'd like to thank Zrinka, Tom, and T for organizing this wonderful conference and for their gracious invitation. I know that things like this are not easy to pull off. So thank you so much for giving us all this opportunity. I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say this. It's a real sort of pleasure to be sharing some of these ideas with you, and I'm looking forward to conversing over the next few days about this. So there is perhaps no figure that embodies the idea of the global Middle Ages more than the scholar and judge Shamsuddin ibn Battuta, right? This figure was born into a scholarly family in the early 14th century in Tangier, right? Which is in modern day northern Morocco, and traveled widely across Africa and Asia over 3 decades. His journeys took him into the very heart of the Islamic world, to the cities of Mecca and Medina, Cairo and Damascus, but also further afield to the Indian Ocean world, the Sultanate of Delhi, the nascent Ottoman Sultanate, Mongol Central Asia, maybe China, we don't know, and to the wealthy Kingdom of Mali in West Africa. He even made a visit to the much diminished, although still impressive, I want to add, courts of al-Andalus and Byzantium. His extensive travels remind us that these were not separate, discrete realms of the earth, but constituted an interconnected world characterized by mutual intelligibility and bound together through intellectual, religious, and mercantile networks. My talk today does not seek to obscure or undermine the importance of Ibn Battuta, but rather to situate him within an extensive community of letters that span the late medieval Islamic West. It seeks to remind us that while Ibn Battuta will continue to sojourn and journey onto our many syllabi, or inform our understanding of the connectivity of the medieval world, he had antecedents, he had contemporaries, and he had successors. Over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, maybe a little longer than that, but I'll try to keep to 20 minutes, I would like to highlight the importance of migration both to and from al-Andalus in reshaping the political landscapes and scholarly cultures of the Mediterranean world during the 13th and 14th centuries. During this period, there were several different directions of migration, and the motives and circumstances that prompted individuals to leave their homelands and establish themselves in new, sometimes distant lands were often varied and multifaceted. My larger project is particularly interested in the ways that patterns of Andalusi migration shaped the intellectual networks, political cultures, and historical memory in the late medieval Mediterranean world. The book that has emerged from this research examines one particular case study, that of Lisān ibn al-Khaṭīb, to illustrate the importance of migration mobility and the transformation of a single family's fortunes in the borderland context of Nasrid Granada. And it focuses primarily on this one member of the family, perhaps the most notable philosopher, chancellor, and chief minister of Nasrid Granada, to show that this was an individual who was deeply connected to many of the leading scholars and functionaries of his age, including Jewish physician philosophers from Toledo, magistrates from Cairo, literateurs from Damascus, and even Ibn Battuta himself, the aforementioned globetrotter from Tangier. Although I'd be happy to speak more about this figure and the specific dynamics of migration in Nasrid Granada in our discussion, my talk today focuses instead on the wider world to which he belonged. I've been writing a lot about this guy. I've been a bit bored, so I decided to take the opportunity here to take a new direction in my research. You can forgive me, I hope. It departs a bit from my abstract. So let me begin by illustrating the broader historical context for the particular migrations and circulations that I'll be discussing today. And this does require us to begin in Iberia. So during the early and mid 13th century, and this is very basic stuff to most of you, just feel free to zone out for a couple of seconds. The Islamic West experienced a series of crises, which transformed the political and cultural landscape of the region. The Almohad Caliphate, which had unified nearly the entirety of Islamic Spain and North Africa for almost a century, fragmented and collapsed. Simultaneously, the Iberian Christian kingdoms conquered most of al-Andalus between 1230 and 1270. These conquests by Castile, Portugal, and Aragon brought the majority of Islamic Spain and Portugal under Christian rule by 1250. By the early decades of the 14th century, the various Christian and Muslim polities in the Western Mediterranean were closely connected through various diplomatic, cultural, and political networks, and despite their intermittent military conflicts, recognized one another as independent kingdoms. Andalusi Muslims were a big part of this world, closely tied with the various Iberian Christian kingdoms, integrated into Genoese and Catalan trade networks in the Western Mediterranean, and closely bound with the Near East, especially through the mechanisms of trade, pilgrimage, diplomacy, and scholarship. There were many communities of Andalusis, not just one, including, and here we have, of course, the very famous Funduk in Granada, right? The center of the Genoese in Granada. The Mudéjars, right? Andalusi Muslims who resided as tax-paying subjects of Iberian Christian kingdoms. And among these individuals, they're not just a static community, right? They were also travelers, pilgrims, diplomats, merchants, and scholars whose writings and activities, and this has been very well documented among Spanish scholarship, whose writings and activities shaped the broader cultural intellectual history of Nasrid Granada, the last surviving Muslim kingdom in medieval Iberia. And it was the product, that kingdom was itself the product of the complex borderland politics of the mid-13th century, which witnessed the migration and resettlement of thousands of Andalusi Muslims and was deeply intertwined with these other communities across the Mediterranean. The very shape of the Nasrid kingdom, the city of Granada, and its institutions owed much to these migrations. Even the names of places like Al-Baisin comes from Al-Bayazin, the inhabitants of Baeza, right, who were basically expelled after the Castilian conquest. So intellectual networks reflect the intertwined histories of the individuals, groups, institutions, and political entities active within the Western Mediterranean and beyond. Andalusi émigrés from the various towns and cities conquered by the Iberian Christian kingdom were particularly significant in establishing a network of scholarly officials across the Mediterranean. They served as a crucial link between al-Andalus, North Africa, and the Near East during the 13th and 14th centuries. And as I mentioned, there were so many different reasons for their itinerancy, right? Whether they're going to the pilgrimage in Mecca, whether they're traders, right? Whether they're going to learn and study with various scholars, there's a lot of reasons why people travel. They also established themselves as royal administrators in various kingdoms in North Africa during the 7th, 13th, and 8th, 14th centuries. The most prominent and well-studied example of this phenomenon, of course, are the Banū, right? The Andalusi family of secretaries, scholars, and judges from Seville, who rose to become chancellors and officials within the newly established Hafsid kingdom in Tunis. Scholar officials, defined here as individuals who were both scholars and functionaries, administrators, or courtiers, and their networks were a fundamental part of this world. These individuals thrived within the new political context characterized by territorial fragmentation and the existence of multiple competing courts of kings and princes across the Islamic West. Some of these individuals even found themselves working within the various courts and administrations of the Iberian Christian kingdoms, serving as a fundamental link between al-Andalus and these emerging polities, and as cultural intermediaries between Latin Christendom and the Islamic world. Their lives and careers were fundamentally intertwined with these borderland dynamics of the Muslim-Christian frontier, while also being immersed within the intellectual processes taking place in the Islamic Mediterranean. So some of these individuals, in fact, had taught in the studium of Alfonso X. Others had received certificates of transmission while studying in the various madrasas in Syria and Egypt, and many would be fundamental in shaping the various institutions of governance and learning in Nasrid Granada itself. So through the life and career of people like Ibn Khaldun, who I should remind us here is an itinerant scholar and functionary who served in various administrations, including Hafsids, Marinids, Nasrids, and Mamluks over a period of 60 years, and he lived to tell the tale, which is what's crazy about his life. There is much to learn about the shared political culture and expansive intellectual network here. So this was a community of letters in the sense that epistolary remained one of the most significant avenues for connections between these various scholars across the Mediterranean. These individuals played a central role in the production of manuscripts, the patronage of learning, and the expansion of royal administration. They shared their books, depositing them in royal libraries across the Islamic world. For example, even though I hesitate, I'm bringing up al-Khaṭīb again. Ibn al-Khaṭīb sent his own monumental comprehensive history of Granada to Cairo, even though he never traveled there. And with the work quickly becoming an important source of knowledge about the Islamic West, and even meriting him some praise from the chief judge of Cairo. Around the same time as he does this, he integrates a translation into Arabic of the Historia de España into his Deeds of the Notables, a very brief passage of the Historia de España, and a very garbled passage. But this Arabic translation was produced by Joseph ibn Abraham ibn Waqar, a Jewish physician philosopher from Toledo who was a close acquaintance of Ibn al-Khaṭīb. So let's now turn to the specific role of Andalusis in establishing intellectual connections within the broader Mediterranean world. So Andalusis had always been deeply connected with the broader Islamic world, right? They served as administrators, scribes, and functionaries in the various North African empires since the 10th century, while large numbers of Andalusis traveled to the Near East since the early Middle Ages. This is nothing new. The jurist and literateur, Abu Bakr Turtushi, for example, settled in Fatimid Alexandria, while Ibn Arabi, the very famous mystic, revolutionizes the world of Sufism when he settles in the Near East. So these individuals were among the many scholars, merchants, mercenaries, pilgrims, and migrants that constitute this interconnected world. I can mention Ibn Jubair, another figure who finds himself on our syllabi. We can talk about any number of people here, right? So during the 13th and 14th centuries, following the Iberian Christian conquest of much of al-Andalus, many Andalusis, although they certainly represent a minority of the intellectual elite, opted for exile from the Islamic West and settled in the Near East, establishing themselves in Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz, among other locations. So the circumstances that prompt this new wave of migration, first of all, scale is much different here. We're talking about a lot of people in comparison with, that we can document in comparison with the earlier centuries. But the motives also of this were quite different. And here we start to actually see a network of Andalusi, almost diasporic scholar officials across these various societies, who play a fundamental role in integrating the Islamic West into the Islamic East. We shouldn't take for granted that integration. We shouldn't assume that there's this unified Islamic world. And even with the careers of these individuals, we're actually able to see fissures in that narrative that they themselves seek to promote, right? We need to be very cautious about this. So these itinerant individuals also served as a bridge between worlds, who played a fundamental role in shaping the memory and reception of al-Andalus in the Near East and North Africa. So during the 13th and 14th century, we see this continuation of a tradition of traveling to the Near East in search of knowledge. I can mention any number of figures. I'll just mention one of Ibn al-Khaṭīb's contemporaries, an individual, a literateur called Abu Ja'far al-Ru'ayni. He famously journeyed across the Islamic world, spending a significant time in Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and the Hijaz, studying with leading scholars. He even produces a work for the Persian-speaking and Turkish-speaking ruler, the Artuqid ruler of Mardin, on sort of Arabic lexicography, right? Which shows us the way in which the rhetorical and poetic abilities of itinerant literateurs secured royal patronage for them, which allowed them to integrate themselves into these courts. And there are so many other examples. We have people that go as far east as Central Asia. We have individuals who settle in Timbuktu, right? I can't express enough how many of these individuals you can find in the sources. So many of these scholars produced a travelogue, a rihla, of course, the most famous of which I think we know, right? In a lot of ways. So these texts do give us a very rich repository of information, but they're much more than that, right? They are insightful in a lot of ways, but we should also remember that, and I can talk more about Ibn Battuta if we want, if we have time in the Q&A, but they also reveal the extensive intellectual contacts between the Mashriq and the Maghrib. And this is actually what's quite important here. But there are also autobiographies, right? The autobiographical dimension of these texts should not be forgotten. They demonstrate the subjectivity of these authors themselves. And there was a considerable amount of prestige attached to scholars in the Islamic West traveling to the East in search of knowledge. It was called the rihla fi talab al-ilm, right? The idea that you go East in search of knowledge and you bring it back and you're basically able to translate that into some level of authority within your own community. So we have a ton of manuscript evidence here of numerous Andalusi scholars such as Mohamad ibn Hizballah al-Wadi-Ashi, for example. This is a fascinating individual who rose to become the chancellor in Marinid, Morocco, who then traveled to the Near East and studied with leading jurists and scholars of hadith during the 13th and 14th centuries. The excellent recent study of his career by Joseph Juncker provides instructive insights about how these individuals served as fundamental nodes of connection between the Islamic West and the Islamic East. And the manuscripts I'm showing here come from that article, an excellent article. These individuals, whose religious and intellectual connections across the Mediterranean were often memorialized and performed through the securing and preservation of certificates of audition, known as ijazas, reflect the extensive community of letters that bound together the Andalusi scholars and their counterparts in North Africa and the Near East. And these scholars included not only men, but also numerous women, especially in the worlds of jurisprudence and hadith. And this is the institution where Asma Sayyid teaches, and she's written the definitive book on this topic of women scholars as teachers of many of these Andalusis in particular. So these ijazas, which could be specified as certificates of audition, sama'at, or reading, qira'at, granted the recipients permission to transmit and teach a given work, and linked them with a specific teacher and scholar who served as a granting authority. There was often great prestige associated with doing so, specifically for those scholars who had the opportunity to study with the Islamic luminaries in Cairo and Damascus, including with Andalusi scholar officials themselves, who had gone there not centuries, but decades earlier, such as Abu Hayyan al-Gharnati, who had established themselves in these regions in earlier decades. And just to give you a quick look here, the ijaza, this is the whole ijaza, but you can see in the handwriting of Abu Hayyan, who had been kind of older by now, his handwriting changes, and you can see their handwriting change over decades. You can see in the dark, in the kind of almost like bold print there, that's him granting an ijaza to the person, right? And this is actually this is an ijaza written in the hand of Khalil ibn Aybak al-Safadi, the most prominent literature in Syria in this period. Just tells you how integrated they were in this period. It established these Andalusis as sort of authorities within the world of Islam, inserting themselves into its political, social, and intellectual genealogies. So these ijaza networks also reflected the role of Andalusis themselves as transmitters of particular forms of knowledge to the Islamic East. It's not just a one-way road here. So they incorporate details that enable modern scholars to learn more about the social context of these scholarly interactions, including the precise location and date of these encounters, the specific books studied and information exchanged, and the nature of the relationship between these scholars. Whether it was in a scholar's home in Granada, a chancery in North Africa, or one of the great mosques of Alexandria, Cairo, Jerusalem, Damascus, or Aleppo, there exists ample evidence of Andalusi scholars, and particularly scholar officials engaging with their Maghribi, North African, and Mashriqi, Near Eastern counterparts, exchanging information, which found its way into the many historical compendia and biographical dictionaries, and essentially constituting an archive for the intellectual legacies of al-Andalus in the Mediterranean world. This is all nice in theory, so I should actually give you something to hang on to here, a case study, right? So the next 10 minutes or so, I'll give you that case study. So the career of Abu Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn al-Hajj al-Tujibi, long names, right, provides a particularly compelling example of these individuals. As someone who lived through what I'm calling the crisis of the 13th century in al-Andalus and settling in Damascus, the trajectory of his life and career reflects that of many Andalusi émigrés scholars during this period. He belonged to an influential family of Andalusi notables from Cordoba, who had played a prominent role as scholars and administrators in the region. The family's fortunes, of course, were dramatically impacted by the Christian conquest of the city in 1236, when they were among those who fled to Seville, where Abu Walid was born around 1241. When Seville itself was conquered, not a great choice of destination, one thinks, right? But of course, this is not self-evident. When Seville was conquered in 1248, the family then is forced to relocate once more, and it was around this time when they journeyed eastwards to Egypt and Syria, where he continued his education and established himself as a leading scholar in his own right. In doing so, he's following in the footsteps of earlier generations of Andalusis. So the extensive education of these people, their extensive intellectual connections, allow them to integrate themselves into their new communities in the Eastern Islamic world. And I have a lot of examples I can share, but I'm not going to do that because I'm going to run out of time. So his son, a guy called Abu Muhammad Abdullah al-Tujibi, was also a leading scholar in Damascus in his own right, indicating the rise of a specific Andalusi Muslim scholarly lineage in the region during the 14th century. So they're perpetuating their own status, their own role in their new societies. They don't just disappear from historical record once they appear in those regions. So he bridges the worlds of al-Andalus in the Near East. And significantly, many of his writings, none of his writings, in fact, have survived directly. His historical writings have survived directly. But one of his students, he was lucky enough to have a very famous student, the renowned Damascene historian Shamsuddin Muhammad al-Zahabi, perhaps the most prolific historian in Islamic history, has preserved several of the historical accounts about the political and history of al-Andalus within his monumental The Histories of the Noble Scholars. You'll see this on the shelves of a lot of people who teach Islamic history around the country. So this is one of the most monumental works of historiography produced in the late medieval Islamic world. And within the work, al-Dhahabi explicitly notes that he narrated several passages from the manuscript written in the handwriting, قرأت بخطه, of Ibn al-Hajj, right? His teacher, which suggests that the latter had written a small work about the history of al-Andalus and that Dhahabi had access to these writings. This small piece of information greatly illuminates the process by which Near Eastern scholars, such as the Dhahabi, were able to incorporate important details about the Islamic West within their historical works, as a result of teacher-student ties that had been established an intellectual network that had been created following the migration of Andalusis to the east. The bulk of al-Dhahabi's narrative of the reign of al-Mutawakkil ibn Hud, this is one of the successor states, the Almohads in al-Andalus, for example, is based on Ibn al-Hajj's own account, which only survives within al-Dhahabi's works. The access of Near Eastern scholars such as al-Dhahabi illustrates the historical importance of these individuals in shaping the legacies of al-Andalus in the broader Islamic world. So the existence of written notes, diaries, and manuscripts illustrates the role of personal archives and documents within the lives of these émigrés scholars. Now we know they had these records, they had them written down, even if these works don't survive as independent works, right? Their preservation also demonstrates the value placed upon them by scholars that integrated them within their larger works. So the particular historical account about Ibn Hud, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but let's just say it is not flattering. This is the individual who kind of reigns between 1229 and 1238, and it's on his watch that those big cities fall. Valencia, Cordoba, Jaén, right? This is, well, not Jaén yet, but eventually it will. So it is not a great thing. And he basically creates a narrative here, and I'm not going to read too much, but he situates Fernando III's conquest of Cordoba, his homeland in particular, as part of a larger plot by Ibn Hud to secure his power at the expense of a rival, right? Through an alliance with Fernando III, right? So this critique of Andalusi political incompetence, military defeat, followed by forced migration and exile are all themes which permeate Ibn al-Hajj's historical account, which mirrors the concern for these themes within the surviving writings of other Andalusi émigrés, whether in Nasrid Granada or North Africa. And this negative portrayal of Ibn Hud greatly impacts al-Dhahabi himself, right? And he does add a final note, right? And he actually tells you where his words begin and where his teachers end, right? This is key. He says, Ibn Hud did not live for much longer after this, for verily God took him. His reign lasted a total of 9 years, 9 months, 9 days. Don't take that too literally. He was assassinated in his sleep, and his body was transferred to Murcia. And on the eve of his death, the Almohads had experienced a resurgence in their power, so his main accomplishment undermined, right? And then after he dies, his own lieutenant, Mohamad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr, the first Nasrid Sultan, establishes his authority. And then, to make things worse for poor Ibn Hud here, he tells us that while in Damascus, I saw Ibn Hud's nephew, the great ascetic Badruddin ibn Hud. He was a mystical philosopher who was in the habit of drinking wine and stumbling around drunk, right? And I was not a fan of mystical philosophy, Dhahabi, so keep this in mind. So this final note served to undermine the Banū Hud completely, whose descendants in al-Andalus were not mentioned. It also demonstrates the familiarity of al-Dhahabi with other Andalusi émigrés in Damascus. So he inadvertently tells us again about the Banū Hud here. The only real reference we have to this is in al-Dhahabi. So he also inherits his teacher's distaste for a particular political formation, right? You're seeing the inheritance of grievances here. So significantly, it's not just this work. We actually have a manuscript that has emerged recently, that has been written in the hand of Ibn al-Hajj. And this appeared on an auction website, as many of these will do, right? Unfortunately now in a private collection. So this is the Kitab al-Tamhid by the Andalusi scholar Ibn Abd al-Barr. So this was an important work on hadith, written by one of the most renowned scholars in Andalusi history. So this particular copy was transcribed by Ibn al-Hajj in Damascus in 695 or 1296. There are a few aspects of this incredible manuscript that require our attention. First, the script and the handwriting itself. This manuscript is written in a clearly Andalusi hand and demonstrates a continuation of particular scribal traditions. It also illustrates the performance of an Andalusi identity, embodied by the maintenance of a particular script. This interplay between script and identity has been very well discussed recently by Umberto Bongianino in his magisterial study of the topic. And the more significant element of this manuscript is, of course, as many medievalists love, the colophon. So this portion of the text reflects the scribe's own voice. The colophon states that this copy, here we go, This copy of the seventh book of the Kitab al-Tamheed was completed on the 30th of Rabi'a al-Thani, 695, March 7th, 1296, by the hands of a humble servant dependent on the mercy of his Lord, Mohamad ibn Abul Walid ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Tujibi ibn al-Hajj al-Qurtubi. May God forgive him. Well, definitely after that, right? So this provides both the date of completion, right? And reflecting the self-identification of the scribe, right? He tells us a lot about himself here. So he provides the most extensive iteration of his genealogy, an attempt to remind us of his illustrious ancestry and his antiquity within al-Andalus. It's supposed to invoke an earlier chief judge of Cordoba who worked for the Almoravids at their height, right? So this reflects also the patronym, right, al-Qurtubi, in order to highlight his Cordoban origins. So this reflects the deep affinity with that city exactly 60 years after the Castilian conquest. And it is doubly significant since he had never gone there. He was born in Seville and established his residence in Damascus, yet Cordoba is the main point of identification. The colophon also tells us that he copied this for his son, Abdullah, and this took place in the city of Damascus. And this helps us situate the place in which the manuscript was created. The world of Ibn al-Hajj, I want to mention, intersects with the world of Ibn Battuta. It does come full circle, right? When the latter arrived in Damascus in August 1326, he tells us that the Imam of the Malikis at the time of my arrival in Damascus was the jurist Abu Umar Ahmad ibn Abil Walid ibn al-Hajj al-Tujibi, Cordoban by origin, Granadan by birth, and resident in Damascus. He used to exercise the imamate of the Malikis alternately with his brother Abdullah. That Abdullah for whom the manuscript was copied, right? So now we know about another son of Ibn al-Hajj here, right? So this reveals that Abdullah was only one of at least two sons of this individual. It also provides a new detail. One of his sons appears to have been born in Granada. This suggests that the Nasrid kingdom may have been a momentary point of transition or settlement for this family. And since I began this talk with Ibn Battuta, I'm going to end with Ibn Battuta. While in Damascus, he appears to have been quite busy, as if he had the time, right? So he also transcribed manuscripts. There are two surviving notes written in Ibn Battuta's own handwriting on a work about hadith by Abu al-Abbas Umar al-Qurtubi, another Cordoban who finds himself in the Near East in the 14th century. The colophon provides several details. It tells us that it was transcribed in the Al-Azaziyah College in Damascus while providing the exact date of transcription. This tells us about the spaces that these scholars moved in. It also informs us that it was written for another Maliki scholar, Abu Hassan Ali al-Sakhawi. This extraordinary manuscript, a copy of yet another Andalusi of Cordoban origin who settled in the Near East, reflects the extensive intellectual networks that bound together Andalusi, North African, and Near Eastern scholars, and Mamluk lands in particular, during the 14th century. So to conclude, this talk has sought to invite conversation. This is just a small sliver of what's out there, right? I could have talked about anything else here, but I do hope it helps us think about how intellectual networks can give us a model to work with, right? Alongside all the other models that we have. It is imperative to recall that itinerant scholars existed alongside and often overlapped with networks of artisans and craftsmen, merchants and mercenaries, and sovereigns and enslaved peoples. Learning, trade, pilgrimage, war, and enslavement were all factors that shaped migration and the formation of political and social networks. Let us not forget, Ibn Battuta had enslaved peoples within his entourage everywhere he went. He engaged in these practices, right? This is part of his world. Let's not idealize this kind of itinerant networks without thinking about the dependency upon these people on those sort of forms of labor and power relations, right? It is also through a careful study of the specific dimensions of this connectivity that we need to challenge traditional periodizations and categorizations, right? So for the Islamic West in particular, it takes us from a narrative in which we're looking only at Granada for some reason and ignoring the Mudekhars, or just the Mudekhars and ignoring Granada, to a world in which they constitute one peg of a much larger world. Thank you very much for your patience, and sorry for going over time, Maya.